If you've ever been replaced,
He's
humiliated,
impressed by
or
your
ignored by
composure.
someone you trusted. Victoria's betrayal at the
Right
hands
this
of her
way,
ex and his
please.
mistress will hit you in the
A
gut.
toast to our future.
One misstep, one human error, her chance at justice begins here. When trust shatters in front of hundreds, the sting cuts deeper than money. Victoria
Our
Lang,
projections
married for
show
over a
strong
decade to
growth.
billionaire CEO Adrian Keller, finds herself sidelined at a glittering gala while his
It's
younger
just an
mistress,
informal
Naomi
discussion.
Vance, commands the spotlight. Victoria walked into the grand ballroom expecting the warm recognition she earned over years of charity and corporate advocacy. The chandeliers glimmered above, reflecting off polished marble floors, and the chatter of investors and board members filled the room. She adjusted her gown, smiled politely at passing acquaintances, and felt a flicker of pride until she noticed the subtle ways the evening had been orchestrated to erase her presence. Adrian Keller, sitting in the center of a VIP cluster, radiated calm composure, offering no reassurance, no glance of acknowledgement. Naomi Vance, standing slightly to his left, glided through the crowd, her laughter light, almost musical, but every note a calculated mark of dominance. Then, with an icy smile, she leaned toward Adrian and whispered, "This is someone else's evening now." The words barely audible, yet in Victoria's ears, they echoed like a gavel striking down her world. Every detail of the gala seemed tailored to highlight Naomi's victory. Victoria's introduction to the board was delayed, the seating arrangement placed her at the far end, where shadows fell across her table. Cameras angled, whether by accident or design, caught Naomi's every smile and movement, leaving Victoria framed in the background, diminished. She felt the eyes of the crowd not looking at her, yet judging her absence, weighing her failure to remain central to Adrian's empire. Victoria's hands pressed to her chest, her breath tightening as humiliation settled in. She felt her pulse against the constriction of her corset, each thump a reminder that control had slipped from her grasp. The room's chatter faded into a low hum, her mind absorbing every snicker, every subtle glance from those she once trusted. Investors she had courted for years offered polite nods, board members avoided her gaze, and friends seemed distant, as though waiting for her to misstep. Naomi's presence was magnetic, deliberately so, a silent announcement of victory. She approached a group of top investors, laughter trailing like a ribbon, and whispered something that made two of them glance toward Victoria with barely concealed judgment. Victoria caught the words just faintly, perhaps she shouldn't have been so ambitious. The sting of that single line burrowed deeper than any overt insult could. Retreating from the swirl of attention, Victoria found the balcony, where city lights sprawled like a distant constellation. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cool glass against her palms, grounding herself against the emotional quake. Her thoughts raced, years of shared decisions, whispered strategies, and private assurances, erased in a single night of curated spectacle. Yet within the ache, a quiet ember of determination flickered. She realized that pain could be a teacher, betrayal could reveal the contours of power. A discreet buzz on her phone broke the moment. Her eyes widened as she read the alert. Adrian had quietly shifted significant corporate shares away from her control. The document displayed numbers, percentages, and a signature, her name replaced by legal annotations she hadn't authorized. Her hands trembled slightly, not just from anger but from the realization that her influence had been stripped in silence. Victoria's mind flicked back to Naomi's smile, the way she positioned herself, the subtle mockery in her gaze. It wasn't enough to be seen, it was the psychological claim, the assertion that Victoria's role, her decades of effort, were disposable. For the first time, the scale of the betrayal became concrete. Naomi hadn't just taken the spotlight, she had redefined the rules, showing Victoria that empire, power, and loyalty were transient. Breathing deeply, Victoria steadied herself. The balcony offered no allies, no reassurance, only the hum of distant city life and the faint music drifting from inside. And yet, within that isolation, she began cataloging possibilities. Every investor glance, every board reaction, every pause in conversation became a detail to remember. She noticed one aide glance at Naomi with a flicker of uncertainty, one minor misstep in how the program was distributed, one legal clause exposed in the press materials. These were small, almost imperceptible, but in the quiet of her own mind, they became threads she could pull. Victoria allowed herself a single thought, whispered to no one, they may have sidelined me tonight, but they've left a trail. Pain and humiliation had sharpened her focus. She could still move, still act, still plan. This wasn't surrender, it was observation. Naomi's triumph was visible, public, undeniable, but Victoria's resilience, unseen and silent, was just beginning to form. She turned back toward the ballroom one last time, inhaled sharply, and pressed a hand to her stomach, not in pity, but in remembrance of what she had at stake. The flicker of resolve grew stronger, subtle, quiet, almost invisible, yet unyielding. Adrian had made a move. Naomi had claimed victory. But the evening, with all its spectacle, had revealed the weaknesses, the cracks, the moments where control had slipped. And Victoria would notice them all. The alert continued to flash on her phone, a detailed ledger showing shifted shares and hidden clauses. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, a quiet promise forming in the heart of betrayal. She wasn't defeated, not yet. Naomi doesn't just smile, every gesture, every glance is calculated to assert dominance, while Victoria feels the sting of being erased in plain sight. The gala had barely settled into its rhythm when Naomi began to assert her control. It wasn't loud, it wasn't brash, it was in the positioning of chairs, the subtle guidance of who spoke first, the timing of introductions. Victoria noticed these shifts almost instinctively, each one a reminder that her place, once central, had been quietly replaced. Adrian sat back in his chair, calm, almost detached, allowing Naomi's presence to dominate. Every laugh she offered seemed to pull his gaze naturally, leaving Victoria's eyes searching for acknowledgement that never came. Naomi's charm was public but precise, designed to overshadow Victoria without an overt clash, a methodical assertion of her victory. She leaned slightly toward Adrian and murmured, "Some people are better suited for the background." The words were soft, yet they carried the weight of dismissal, slicing into Victoria's awareness like a sharp knife. Victoria's chest felt tight. She pressed her hands lightly to her torso, a subtle grounding gesture as the room continued around her. Her breath came quick, not from panic, but from the sheer realization of how meticulously her presence had been minimized. Cameras angled almost imperceptibly to catch Naomi in perfect light, speeches were timed to highlight her wit and charm, while Victoria's contributions were bracketed in silence or ignored entirely. Every micro-action had been calculated, every gesture choreographed to emphasize that she no longer belonged in the space. Despite the humiliation, Victoria's mind began to flicker with awareness. She noticed one minor procedural error on a report sitting on the head table, a misfiled clause in an acquisition plan, overlooked by a distracted assistant. It was tiny, almost insignificant in the larger scheme, but Victoria registered it. A spark of something, hope, perhaps, or strategy, ignited briefly in the pit of her chest. It wasn't full confidence, not yet, but the first hint that she could see cracks in the perfection Naomi tried to present. Gestures, expressions, and posture continued to dominate the room. Naomi's laugh, just a beat too long, a tilt of the head during a toast, a carefully chosen pause in conversation, all reinforced psychological control. Board members followed her lead almost unconsciously. Investors nodded slightly at Naomi's suggestions, failing to glance at Victoria when she tried to offer commentary. Victoria felt herself shrinking in the sea of observation, a single figure contained by the architecture of attention, the choreography of human interaction. Leaning against the balcony railing, Victoria exhaled quietly, steadying her emotions. She wasn't broken, yet, but the rawness of rejection pressed against her awareness. One moment she could see the enormity of her exclusion, the next, a single detail stood out: a filing assistant had skipped a line in Naomi's favor, one that could be exploited if timing and patience aligned. The realization wasn't strategic yet, it was survival, a flicker of recognition that the world could be read and small openings could exist even in triumphs as complete as Naomi's. Victoria's focus was sensory now, the subtle pause in a conversation when Naomi approached, the way her heels clicked in rhythm across the polished floor, the gentle ripple of attention following her gestures. Each moment amplified humiliation, yes, but also fed the first stirrings of internal resistance. She allowed herself to feel the pain, the sting, the isolation, letting the audience of her mind witness it fully before considering any reaction. A single whispered joke from Naomi toward an investor, barely audible, carried the same dismissal Victoria had felt in her marriage over the years. It was personal, but it was also public. The cruel elegance of the action reminded Victoria that power wasn't taken, it was quietly commanded. She tightened her grip on the balcony rail, her knuckles whitening, the quiet resolve flickering again. She couldn't yet act, her emotional presence was still raw, but the observation was precise. Naomi's brilliance and cruelty were on display, and Victoria would catalogue every move. For several minutes, Victoria allowed herself to exist in this emotional limbo, watching Naomi operate, observing Adrian's passive compliance, feeling the isolation seep into every corner of her awareness. She noticed the subtle misalignment of a single document, the way one investor glanced toward Naomi with a mix of admiration and doubt, the slight hesitation in Naomi's assistant when delivering materials. These were minor, almost imperceptible, but to Victoria, they became markers of human imperfection, openings for eventual leverage. She whispered under her breath, more to steady herself than to assert control, "They may have the room tonight, but not everything is theirs." The words were soft, almost lost in the hum of music and chatter, yet they anchored her. Naomi's triumph was undeniable, but Victoria's awareness was awakening. The room's arrangements, the timing of interactions, the subtle hierarchy, every detail could become a clue, every small error a potential foothold for her quiet counteractions. The balcony offered a temporary sanctuary. Victoria pressed a hand to her temple, inhaling slowly, exhaling more quietly, allowing the humiliation to exist without letting it define her. Pain and observation intertwined, she felt invisible, yet hyper-aware, powerless, yet alert. Naomi's dominance was brilliant, cruel, absolute in the moment, but not flawless. And within those minor human imperfections, Victoria began to see possibility. A confidential note slipped under her arm by an unobserved aide reveals Naomi's intent to seize control of an upcoming acquisition, her first tangible clue that this public dominance could be challenged. Behind the glittering boardrooms and polite applause, hidden alliances quietly shift, threatening to erase Victoria's influence entirely. Victoria sat in the quiet of her office the morning after the gala, the echo of Naomi's words still biting in her mind, "Some people are better suited for the background." She had thought the humiliation at the event was the peak, but now she saw the deeper currents, the invisible hands moving in corridors, whispering agreements she hadn't been invited to witness. Every document she opened felt altered, every signature she scanned felt suspicious. One key company fund, a trust designated for strategic acquisitions, had suspicious transfers that didn't match previous confirmations, while a recently acquired property was allocated differently in the internal ledger. Her heart pounded as she realized the depth of manipulation. Lawyers she had once trusted now seemed to offer subtle nods in Naomi's favor, financial advisors hesitated just long enough to signal alignment elsewhere. A single senior board member, with a slight tilt of his head and an almost imperceptible nod, acknowledged Naomi's influence in a meeting that was meant to discuss neutral operations. Victoria could not ignore it. The weight of isolation pressed on her chest as she considered past allies, people who had once celebrated her successes, now offering hollow smiles or clipped nods, their loyalty uncertain at best. The operations of Stanton Enterprises appeared normal on the surface. Reports were delivered on time, meetings followed agendas, investor letters went out punctually. To any outsider, everything was stable. But Victoria knew better. The misallocation of funds, the altered priorities in acquisition plans, the subtle exclusion from strategic discussions, all pointed to a private reality where she was systematically removed from influence. It was methodical, precise, and terrifying in its quietness. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her hands to her face, feeling a mix of disbelief and heartbreak. One small error in a spreadsheet, one overlooked clause, suddenly seemed like a mountain in the face of orchestrated control. Her mind raced, cataloging every irregularity she had observed, a meeting scheduled without her knowledge, an internal memo that conveniently excluded her input, whispers in the hallway when her name came up. It wasn't overt, there were no shouting matches, no public accusations, only the insidious sense that every structural decision, every human gesture, was calculated to reinforce Naomi's dominance and marginalize her. For a moment, Victoria's composure faltered. She felt the sting of helplessness as she recalled a time when she had influenced the very decisions now being redirected away from her. She remembered the gala, the way cameras had been angled, the subtle gestures of staff moving toward Naomi, the way Adrian had allowed it all to happen. The visual humiliation had been striking, but the invisible betrayal in boardrooms, behind closed doors, cut even deeper. Victoria pressed her fingers to the desk, her chest tight, as if bracing against the weight of systemic betrayal. Every breath was measured, deliberate, as she tried to absorb the enormity of what had already been done. This wasn't a single act of cruelty, it was a machinery of exclusion, a quiet conspiracy that had taken root and spread. Despite the shock, there was a flicker of awareness. She began to notice the pattern of progression, the way minor adjustments were made gradually, imperceptibly, so that no one could accuse the others of wrongdoing. The fund misallocation, the reassignment of property, the careful timing of approvals, it all pointed to a system tilted against her. Yet within that awareness, there was a seed of possibility. A tiny opening had appeared. The board member's subtle nod suggested that not all decisions were unanimous. Maybe leverage could still be found, small and careful, without alerting the conspirators. Her reflections were interrupted by a faint ping on her laptop. A confidential memo, slipped into her inbox by an anonymous aide, detailed that a senior board member had accepted a bribe. The revelation tightened her chest in fear and disbelief. The human betrayal, the tangible proof of corruption, made the stakes horrifyingly real. Victoria pressed her palms to the sides of her face, feeling the quiet panic surge. The empire she had helped build now felt like shifting sand under her feet. Every ally she once trusted now seemed suspect. Every document, every contract, every meeting could conceal another betrayal. She took a deep breath, placing her hands flat on the desk. The office felt both immense and claustrophobic. Outside, the city moved on as if oblivious to the undercurrents she now faced. She replayed old moments of support, past conversations, late-night reassurances from colleagues, but each memory now carried a shadow, a reminder that trust was fragile and loyalty conditional. This was a different battle. It was subtle, hidden, psychological, and yet far more dangerous than any public humiliation she had endured. Victoria's mind gradually shifted from shock to cautious focus. She didn't yet have a clear path, but she understood the landscape. One misfiled clause, one overlooked signature, one hesitant board member, these could become footholds in the future. The betrayal was vast, but human error was always present. She allowed herself the smallest measure of hope. If she observed carefully, acted patiently, and waited for the right moment, she might reclaim control. Her hand rested on a single document detailing the suspicious transfers. She traced a line with her finger, imagining how this piece alone could expose the first crack in the carefully constructed facade. The fear, heartbreak, and disbelief were still raw, but now mingled with the faintest sense that the tide could shift. One step at a time, she would learn the machinery of betrayal and begin to dismantle it from within. A bribe to a senior board member complicates Victoria's next move. She now knows the system is against her, but she doesn't yet know who can truly be trusted. Every friendship is tested, every support system seems false. Victoria begins to feel the crushing weight of true isolation as allies vanish and betrayals surface. Victoria walked the quiet corridors of Stanton Enterprises, each step echoing a growing emptiness. The familiar office spaces, once filled with bustling colleagues and supportive voices, now felt cold and distant. Former confidants avoided her gaze, their smiles hollow, their nods perfunctory. In private conversations, subtle cues revealed hidden motives, softly exchanged glances between board members, hesitant pauses when her name came up, and averted eyes during discussions she was still technically entitled to participate in. Every interaction carried the invisible weight of calculated distance, and Victoria felt the sharp sting of betrayal in each fleeting glance. One ally, whom she had trusted for years, offered what appeared to be reassurance during a brief phone call. "We'll support you, in the ways we can," the voice said, careful and measured. But the words rang hollow, carrying undertones of self-interest and opportunism. Victoria's mind immediately drew connections, this ally's recent enthusiasm for Naomi's initiatives, the timing of reassignment memos, the subtle alignment with the Mistress's faction. Trust had become a dangerous currency. One misstep, one misplaced confidence, could reinforce the isolation she felt pressing from all sides. Emotional collapse hit her in a moment of quiet solitude. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling it tighten painfully, each breath shallow and deliberate. The reality of being alone in a room full of people, professionals who once seemed reliable, crushed her, leaving a hollow ache that spread from her chest to her limbs. In the privacy of her office, she closed her eyes, visualizing the stark, empty offices she now had to navigate alone. The echo of ignored phone calls, unanswered emails, and silent board meetings flashed through her mind like a cinematic montage, each moment reinforcing the depth of her isolation. Victoria's heart beat faster with the understanding that Naomi's influence was not only pervasive but insidious. The operational manipulations of her team were subtle yet effective. Documents she needed were misfiled, meeting invitations arrived late, and questions she raised were redirected or ignored. To outsiders, everything appeared smooth and professional. But for Victoria, the omissions were glaring, forming a web of exclusion she could neither ignore nor directly confront without risk. The system that had once supported her was now weaponized against her. Despite the despair, awareness sharpened. She began noting small, human errors around Naomi's sphere: an overconfident assistant misreading instructions, a miscommunicated schedule, a hesitation in the secretary's voice when announcing board discussions. These human cracks offered the faintest glimmer of opportunity. Yet even these were wrapped in the pervasive sense of control that Naomi exercised, reminding Victoria that patience was essential. She could not act rashly, she had to survive within the isolation first. Memories of previous loyalty haunted her. The same ally who had once defended her in critical negotiations now offered only vague, half-hearted assurances. Every past defense now felt hollow, a bitter reminder that people could change when ambition or fear dictated. Victoria pressed a hand to her forehead, letting the exhaustion and emotional fatigue weigh down, feeling the gravity of knowing she was mostly alone. The loneliness was palpable, and it sharpened her senses. She began to see patterns in human behavior not as abstract strategy, but as signals of weakness, hesitation, or greed. She paced quietly, imagining the next series of interactions with board members and executives. Her mind flashed to different scenarios: a silent, empty office, the cold echo of a deserted hallway, and a boardroom where Naomi's voice carried authority over absent allies. Each image reinforced her awareness of how deeply she had been marginalized. Yet, in those same mental flashes, she saw where subtle leverage could be applied: a misfiled memo here, a hesitant acknowledgement there. Victoria's posture remained firm despite the internal turmoil. She kept her chest tight, her breath measured, the quiet humiliation evident only to herself. She allowed herself to feel the despair fully, to acknowledge that the isolation was real and painful. There was no premature calculation of countermoves, only the recognition that the social and emotional landscape had shifted dangerously. Through the suffocating loneliness, a quiet resolve began to flicker. Victoria understood that survival required not brute force, but observation and patience. She would continue to watch, continue to note small slips in the otherwise rigid control Naomi exhibited, and prepare herself for the right moment to act. Emotional resilience, not immediate triumph, became her ally. Every small human error could be a foothold if she timed her response correctly. The day faded into evening, and the office lights dimmed. Victoria stood by the window, looking out at the city below, absorbing both the enormity of the betrayal and the faintest spark of determination rising within her. Isolation was a heavy, almost suffocating weight, but within it, she felt the first stirrings of calculated patience, quiet, human, and unyielding. Victoria receives an unmarked note hinting that Naomi is manipulating investor votes for the next major acquisition, an invisible maneuver that could determine whether Victoria regains influence or is further marginalized. Who can you trust when everyone seems to have an agenda? Victoria must navigate a world where loyalty is rare, testing each connection carefully. Victoria sat alone in her office, the soft hum of fluorescent lights accentuating the emptiness around her. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, and it pressed her to consider who, if anyone, could still be counted on. She knew she had to check her assumptions, to reach out to someone who had once seemed reliable, even if the world had shifted. The first contact was a trusted corporate advisor, someone who had defended her in past board meetings and who had once whispered encouragements when power moves threatened her position. When the call connected, the advisor's voice sounded familiar but distant. "I will support you where possible," came the measured response, careful not to commit too fully. The half-truth landed sharply. Victoria realized that loyalty had become transactional, contingent on opportunity rather than principle. The advisor spoke as if providing comfort, but there was no warmth, no true assurance. Victoria's chest tightened, a knot of heartbreak forming, as she understood that past support could now be bought, shifted, or abandoned. Her mind flicked back to memory, moments when the same advisor had gone to bat for her during high-stakes negotiations, challenging executives on her behalf. Those memories now felt hollow, replaced with caution and mistrust. It was a stark reminder that even those who appeared closest could be swayed by ambition, fear, or the allure of Naomi's growing influence. The stark contrast between past loyalty and current half-measures intensified her sense of isolation. Private calls and messages over the next hours confirmed her suspicion. Subtle nods, carefully chosen words, and delayed responses indicated that some friends and allies had quietly aligned with Naomi. Each small revelation was like a pinprick, reminding Victoria of the precariousness of her position. One brief micro-moment stood out. The advisor hesitated mid-sentence, glancing as if checking their own alignment, before carefully finishing a vague reply. It was a minor pause, almost imperceptible, but Victoria felt it resonate, proof that even those closest could no longer be taken at face value. Victoria didn't react impulsively. Instead, she quietly recorded notes, cataloging each hesitation, each choice of words, each subtle hint of duplicity. Emotional fatigue was heavy, pressing on her like a tangible weight, but it sharpened her awareness. She realized that in this world, a single misjudgment could spell disaster, and she needed to stay grounded, patient, and observant. There would be no rash moves, no overt challenges, not yet. Despite the disappointment, Victoria identified rare moments of true loyalty. These were fleeting, a brief affirmation, a cautious nod, a remembered act of defense from the past. Each small signal was precious, signaling the tiniest foothold amid overwhelming uncertainty. She learned to cherish the rare glimpses of reliability, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that even these could vanish at the next opportunity. The balance between hope and skepticism became her daily calculation. Her emotional state was raw. The heartbreak and isolation weren't just professional, they were personal. Victoria felt the weight of being betrayed by those she had trusted most, the sting amplified by the public humiliation she had already endured. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself breathe, press her hands to her chest, and process the quiet ache that came from knowing someone she had considered an ally was now unpredictable. It was a momentary surrender to her feelings, a small concession before she could steel herself for action. The day's interactions painted a map of the corporate battlefield, subtle alignments, unspoken agreements, and the faint traces of strategy among Naomi's supporters. But unlike before, Victoria's focus wasn't on immediate counterattacks or complex maneuvers. Instead, she concentrated on understanding the human element, who could be persuaded, who was already lost, and who might still be reclaimed. The emotional stakes were as high as the professional ones. Every decision carried the risk of further isolation or exposure. By evening, Victoria's awareness had deepened. She knew the importance of timing and discretion. Any misstep could reveal her intentions prematurely or solidify Naomi's advantage. Patience became a shield, observation, a weapon. She quietly absorbed every word, every pause, every glance, allowing the emotional tension to sharpen her perception without dictating her next moves too early. The emotional exhaustion was real, but it strengthened her vigilance rather than breaking her spirit. Finally, as the office emptied and shadows stretched across the walls, a discreet piece of information arrived, a tip that Naomi was arranging a secret meeting with key investors for an upcoming acquisition. The revelation sent a fresh spike of anxiety and determination through Victoria. This was the first actionable insight, but it also confirmed that she remained outnumbered, under pressure, and at the mercy of the smallest misjudgments. Emotional resilience, patient observation, and quiet endurance would be required before she could act. Victoria now knows that Naomi and certain investors are planning behind closed doors, but she cannot yet identify all the players. Every conversation, every hesitation, and every subtle gesture matters. Victoria's next move must be precise, or her influence could slip further away. Embarrassment becomes fuel. Victoria begins reclaiming influence with patience and subtlety, testing the waters without revealing her hand. Victoria sat back in her office chair, the low hum of the city outside a stark contrast to the tension that coiled inside her. She had spent the past days cataloging what had been taken from her, not just positions or titles, but trust, dignity, and the subtle respect she had once commanded. Her mind lingered on one tiny oversight, a contract she had barely glanced at, an entry missing a signature. To most, it was insignificant, but Victoria saw it as the first crack in Naomi's carefully constructed facade. She touched the document lightly, feeling a rush of cautious hope. The evidence she had begun collecting over the past week revealed patterns of manipulation, small but telling, orchestrated by Naomi and supported by quiet complicity from advisors who had once sworn loyalty to Victoria. Each item, a misfiled memo, an overlooked clause, a subtly altered report, added to the picture. And yet, Victoria did not rush. She knew that showing eagerness or force would alert Naomi, who thrived on control and perception. Instead, Victoria began quietly enlisting allies, a legal counsel who had once advised her on inheritance disputes, a journalist with a reputation for discretion, and a financial analyst familiar with the inner workings of the company. Each was approached carefully, without revealing her full intent, creating a web of quiet support ready to act when the moment was right. That tiny win, the partial document, was more than just an anomaly, it was a foothold. It reminded Victoria that the empire wasn't absolute, that cracks existed even in Naomi's seemingly perfect descent. Sitting at her desk, she pressed her palms together, feeling a spark of internal strength return. Her chest no longer tightened with panic but with controlled awareness. She noted human errors in subtle gestures, in hesitations during calls, in offhand remarks at meetings. One board member mispronounced a company name, one assistant hesitated before answering a question, small things, but enough to tip scales if leveraged carefully. Time became her ally. Victoria reminded herself that patience was as powerful as aggression. Any premature move could undo weeks of observation and careful assessment. She watched, waited, and documented. She observed meetings from the back of the room, noting how Naomi positioned herself, how she smiled at certain investors, and how her answers became measured under unexpected scrutiny. Victoria allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of minor control without drawing attention. A microsmile crossed her face when she realized that even small shifts, an investor nod here, a hesitant advisor glance there, could be quietly manipulated to her advantage. Victoria's internal monologue reflected cautious optimism. Maybe this could work, or maybe it's nothing, she whispered to herself. The uncertainty was heavy but motivating. She did not imagine bold, sweeping moves, she imagined incremental, human-centered actions that could quietly alter perception, realign loyalty, and reclaim authority without overt confrontation. Her observation wasn't cold calculation, it was emotional intelligence, paying attention to the human cues that Naomi underestimated or ignored. Late into the evening, Victoria reviewed her notes again. One clause misfiled, one signature missing, a half-sent memo from a board assistant, each small detail was logged meticulously. She allowed herself to imagine subtle outcomes, Naomi caught off guard, investors questioning choices silently, a quiet ripple of doubt spreading without anyone realizing who initiated it. In the quiet of her office, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks, a sense of measured control returning. The embarrassment, isolation, and fear from the gala were now fuel, a reminder that every small oversight could be leveraged, every subtle hesitation observed. Her eyes scanned a partial file Naomi had carelessly left unsecured. It hinted at future overreach, potential acquisitions Naomi had intended to consolidate under her control. Victoria's pulse quickened, not with adrenaline, but with quiet, determined focus. She realized the first moves of reclaiming influence were already taking shape. Every action from this point forward had to remain invisible, subtle, human-focused. Corporate strategy would not dictate the pace, her understanding of human behavior, patience, and emotional insight would. The emotional rhythm of the day taught her resilience. She could feel the quiet strength growing within, a controlled fire, aware but not reckless. There was no need to announce victories or challenge Naomi publicly. Instead, Victoria's power built silently, internally, an imperceptible shift in confidence that would later manifest in concrete advantage. She pressed her hands lightly against the desk, grounding herself in the moment, letting the quiet determination settle in. Her reflection in the window was one of composure and poise. Nothing was solved yet, the battle was far from over. But she had begun reclaiming what had been stripped away, one small observation, one subtle correction, and one minor document at a time. Each detail, each human reaction, became a thread she could pull when the moment came. Her patience, endurance, and insight, built from pain and betrayal, were now her tools. Victoria discovers a set of confidential files Naomi left unsecured, hinting at overreach and upcoming acquisitions. It's incomplete, names missing, clauses partially written, but it is enough to suggest that the balance of power could be quietly shifted if Victoria acts carefully. Naomi's confident facade begins to falter, the first human crack appears, and Victoria quietly notices the shift. The room was tense, but Victoria barely moved. Her eyes, calm but sharp, traced the subtle change in the air. One senior board member, usually unwavering, hesitated when reviewing a leaked report. His hand wavered over the papers, a small pause that revealed uncertainty. Victoria's heart skipped, not from triumph, but from the realization that the balance of control might finally be shifting. Naomi's smile, usually confident and unshakable, faltered when she reached for a folder on her desk. She froze, fingers brushing the papers too slowly, her eyes flicking toward the board member for reassurance. A tiny, human slip, barely noticeable, but for Victoria, it spoke volumes. The mistress who had dominated every interaction for months now had an imperceptible crack in her armor. As meetings extended beyond their usual time, Naomi's responses became cautious. Her voice, previously commanding, now held an edge of hesitation. She double-checked facts mid-sentence, glanced at the investors slightly longer than necessary, and adjusted her gestures as if to reclaim invisible control. Victoria leaned back, chest tight with anticipation, yet restrained. She allowed herself only a flicker of satisfaction, mindful that the war was far from over. Across the table, one key investor subtly shifted allegiance. A nod here, a slightly prolonged glance at Victoria's presentation materials. It was small, but unmistakable. Naomi noticed, and for the first time, she hesitated before answering questions, her carefully rehearsed poise showing signs of strain. The mistress's commanding aura now carried a trace of doubt, and Victoria felt a quiet thrill. Control was no longer entirely out of her hands. The emotional impact on Naomi was palpable. Her hands trembled briefly as she adjusted documents, her gaze scanning the room in a subtle, searching manner. She sensed tension, something was off, but she couldn't identify the source. The usually composed and untouchable woman now experienced a flicker of vulnerability, an unfamiliar human feeling that had eluded her control for so long. Victoria absorbed the sight, her pulse steady, noting that victory was not immediate but quietly unfolding. Victoria's strategy remained subtle. She did not call attention to the cracks, did not gloat. She observed the first ripple of doubt like a scientist noting a chemical reaction, slow, deliberate, and crucial. She watched how Naomi's eyes lingered on specific board members, how her posture shifted slightly when faced with unexpected questions. Every small detail was recorded mentally, every hesitation became a thread to pull in the coming battles. The psychological weight of the moment hung heavy in the room. Naomi's authority was no longer absolute. The first human crack had appeared, exposing a vulnerability that could be exploited, if carefully, patiently, and without haste. Victoria felt a quiet sense of justice, not revenge, but acknowledgement that patience and resilience could counter arrogance and cruelty. Even as the first subtle shift became evident, Victoria maintained her composure. Her breathing was steady, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. The room, filled with powerful people and whispered alliances, had shifted imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. Naomi's eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, the faintest acknowledgement that something within the carefully curated system was slipping. The board member's initial hesitation had created a small ripple. Victoria knew this was just the beginning. Small doubts, tiny hesitations, and minute human reactions were all that was needed to destabilize the mistress's perceived control. The mistress's confidence had begun to waver, and Victoria silently noted every nuance, every micro-expression that revealed the cracks in Naomi's carefully constructed image. Victoria allowed herself a moment to feel the quiet satisfaction that her observations, patience, and endurance had not been wasted. She understood that the public facade of control could crumble not through confrontation, but through careful, human observation, letting Naomi's own mistakes and insecurities surface. Her own quiet power was emerging, not through force, but through awareness and restraint. The moment was intimate and fragile. Victoria did not speak, she did not celebrate. She simply acknowledged the shift, feeling a deep, controlled satisfaction that the first cracks had appeared. Her patience, her quiet resilience, and her unwavering focus were paying off. The game was beginning to turn, though subtly. Naomi knows something is wrong, a subtle unease she cannot explain. But she doesn't know who is behind it, or that Victoria has been quietly watching every human crack, waiting for the perfect moment to turn hesitation into leverage. One small misstep can unravel an empire. Adrian Whitford overlooks a critical detail, and Victoria sees it all. Adrian sits at the boardroom table, signing off on a key contract. His focus is distant, distracted by the gala's aftermath and media chatter, and in his haste, he fails to notice a missing signature on a crucial clause. This small error is invisible to the rest of the room, but not to Victoria. She spots the incomplete line immediately, her pulse quickening, realizing that even in subtle negligence, leverage can be found. Naomi, sitting across from him, catches a slight hesitation in Adrian's pen stroke. Her brows knit together, a micro-expression of confusion and unease, but she cannot determine the source. For the first time, the mistress who has manipulated every boardroom and investor is uncertain. The faintest ripple of doubt begins to fracture the illusion of invincibility she's carefully cultivated. Victoria's chest tightens, a combination of relief and cautious anticipation. She presses a hand lightly to the desk, steadying her breath, feeling the weight of her patience beginning to bear fruit. This is no dramatic victory, no moment of celebration, it is subtle, intimate, and deeply satisfying. She recognizes that power is not always gained by confrontation, sometimes it is revealed in the quiet failings of others. The oversight is small, a single missing signature, but the implications are enormous. Victoria begins to map its potential silently in her mind, seeing how it could restrict Naomi's control over upcoming acquisitions. She imagines the careful recalibration needed to exploit it fully, timing each step to avoid detection, knowing that patience now will yield far greater results later. As Adrian continues to sign other documents with casual confidence, he remains unaware of the fracture forming beneath him. Naomi's attempts to maintain composure are strained. She double-checks the papers she holds, her movements slower, her smile slightly forced. The room feels charged with a subtle tension, though no one else notices it. Victoria observes every micro-movement, every flicker of doubt, storing each detail for the right moment. There is a quiet, almost imperceptible human lesson here. Empires crumble not only from attacks but from neglect, misjudgment, and overconfidence. Victoria senses the fragility, the tiny fault line that could be expanded. She does not rush, her mind balances caution with curiosity, calculating without appearing to do so. She feels a quiet thrill, an intimate knowledge that patience and observation have finally revealed a way to shift control. In this moment, her own resilience shines through. Months of betrayal, humiliation, and strategic watching have led to this single point of insight. She allows herself a tiny, private exhale, knowing that she can act, but must wait for maximum effect. The first tangible sign that the balance of power can be altered is before her eyes, and the possibility ignites a controlled surge of confidence. The human errors of Adrian and Naomi are subtle, but Victoria recognizes them clearly. One misstep, one hesitation, one overlooked signature, these are enough to start a chain reaction. She imagines how a single document could later lock Naomi out of future decisions, how investor perception could shift quietly, and how the mistress's unshakable image might crack under mounting pressure. Victoria does not reach for her phone, does not raise her voice, she simply observes, lets the moment settle in. The lesson is clear: control is not brute strength but quiet awareness. Small lapses in attention, minor oversights, and the human tendency to assume invulnerability are all she needs. Each observation sharpens her, each hesitation she notes adds to a slow, methodical accumulation of leverage. Hands pressed on the polished oak desk, Victoria feels her resolve solidify. She is calm, collected, aware of the stakes, and ready to act when the moment is truly right. There is no hubris, no thrill of immediate triumph. The room continues as usual for the untrained eye, yet for Victoria, a subtle power shift has begun. Naomi fidgets slightly with the papers, Adrian moves on unaware, and a quiet smile touches Victoria's lips, small, controlled, private. The intimate realization settles over her: power is often hidden in human imperfection. Observing without exposure, waiting without impatience, Victoria understands that she can influence outcomes without dramatic confrontation. This is the quiet dominance of patience, the satisfaction of recognizing opportunity in the simplest of oversights. That minor oversight, a single missing signature, could later freeze Naomi's access to critical resources, but Victoria must wait and watch, knowing that the next move could reshape the balance of power entirely. As the credits roll, you realize this isn't just Victoria's story, it's a reminder that trust can be fragile, and courage can rise quietly from the shadows. Notice how every glance, every small hesitation, shifted the balance of power. If moments like this resonate with you, take a second to let others see it too, share the story, and stay connected to uncover how justice unfolds. And as you reflect, ask yourself, if someone you trusted most suddenly turned against you, what would you do first, and would you fight silently like Victoria or act boldly? Share your thoughts below. Your answer could reveal more than just opinion, it could show your own inner strength.